Same-sex marriage is on everyone's mind right now. How did we get here? What would it mean for Australia, and how should we respond? Well, by 1990, leaders of the gay movement were saying that the gay revolution had failed. The AIDS epidemic was in full flight, homosexuality was widely seen as dangerous, unnatural and perverse, and sodomy was still a criminal offence in many jurisdictions in the Western world. A neuropsychiatrist, Marshall Kirk, and a public relations consultant, Hunter Madsen, published a book, After the Ball, with one goal: to reverse this failure and make homosexuality mainstream. This new strategy was to work through three main techniques. The first, desensitization, works by desensitizing people's feelings towards homosexuality, inundating the mainstream with a continuous flood of gay-related media presented in the least offensive fashion. The second technique they called jamming, where you portray anyone opposing homosexuality as bigots who are to be shamed, criticised, hated and shunned. Conversion was the third and final tactic, designed to exchange one false stereotype for another equally false, influencing people's emotions, minds and will through a planned psychological attack. Make the mainstream believe that the gay lifestyle is mainstream, and the propaganda is concluded. Anyone who disagrees is a homophobe, and the gay lifestyle is normalised. These processes were successfully instigated, and by 2001 in the Netherlands, same-sex marriage was law. Within 16 years, a number of countries had changed their marriage law, all without a vote from their citizens. In Bermuda, Croatia, Slovenia and Ireland, a referendum was offered. Each said no to redefining marriage except for Ireland. In Ireland, 62% voted yes and 38% no, but in that non-compulsory referendum, 39% of eligible voters didn't even participate in the vote. This is a critical reminder that you need to make your vote count here in Australia in the postal survey. In Canada, politicians redefined their marriage law in 2005. Canadians were promised that there were protections in place for freedom of speech, religious freedoms and parental rights. What happened? Parental rights attacked. Parents had to accept radical gender and sexual education in Canadian schools and were unable to remove their children if they disagreed. And in Ontario, this new gender theory has even been incorporated into child protection law, meaning authorities may deem children to be at risk if their parents don't subscribe to this radical new thinking. Free speech attacked. Tribunals and anti-discrimination laws opposing divergent views, and some Canadians losing their livelihoods as a result of simply expressing their support for traditional marriage. Religious rights attacked. Religious people and organisations facing legal sanction and regulatory disadvantage for their objections to the new views of sexuality and gender. Adoption agencies, social services, schools, universities, all affected. As we think about all this for Australia, we should also remember that in the 2016 census, less than 1% of couples were same-sex couples. If a third of those couples were married, similar to Canada for example, that is 1/3 of less than 1% of couples, or 0.13% of all Australians. So in return for giving a tiny fraction of Australians the ability to say they're legally married, the whole country faces huge threats to our most deeply valued freedoms. The hope had been that the redefinition of marriage would result in greater happiness for this section of the community. Sadly, this has not been the case. In places overseas where same-sex marriage exists, the suicide rate is markedly higher in these relationships than in their heterosexual counterparts. And domestic abuse is a real issue too, with studies reporting figures of 17 to 45% of lesbians experiencing at least one act of violence in their relationship, and 20 to 90% experiencing at least one act of psychological abuse. Australia already has civil unions in place for same-sex couples, which together with the 84 legislative changes made in 2008, provide same-sex couples almost identical legal rights and benefits to marriages. So what happens if Australia redefines marriage? Well, taking gender difference out of marriage goes in hand with bringing new LGBTIQ visions of gender and sexuality into the classroom and beyond, with little room left for those who hold to conventional views of gender and sexuality. Parental rights will be impacted through education programs and regulations and state-sanctioned anti-discrimination speech laws. Australia has some of the poorest legal protections for freedom of speech in the Western world. It is not even in the Constitution. And religious freedoms will be seriously curtailed too. Australia's lucky. We can vote, and we already respect the rights of same-sex couples through civil unions and our de facto laws. With too many freedoms at risk, redefining marriage will take away more from us than we would ever gain. We must vote, and we must vote no. Authorised by A. Ricker, Sydney.